So good evening, everyone, and welcome to all of you. I'm Chava Samuelson. I'm the Director of Jewish Studies at Arizona State University. I'm also Regents Professor of History and Irving and Miriam Lowe Professor of Modern Judaism. We are very happy to host all of you in the last online program for 2021. And those of you who have been with us during the last 2 years have heard me say the same kind of description about Jewish studies, but I will repeat it because new people may join us or may have joined us. So we are a hybrid unit of academic degree granting program as well as a research center. We serve as an intellectual resource for all aspects of the Jewish experience by offering undergraduate and graduate courses, research conferences, public lectures, and historical exhibits. Our goal is to foster critical inquiry about the past and to invite everyone to study about the past, especially the Jewish past, in order to address the challenges of the present and perhaps even prepare for the future. COVID-19 pandemic has been a major challenge, as we all know, both in 2020 and in 2021. And we responded to it by holding our programs like this one on Zoom. The technology actually has significantly enlarged the scope of our outreach, and we now have people who listen to our programs practically from all over the world. It's kind of very rewarding. So we started the semester by a program on religion and science. We featured two members of our faculty, Professor Adam Cohen, Professor Paul Cassell. Then in October, we had one guest lecture about campus anti-Semitism, but the main activity was a conference on Jewish-Muslim relations through the ages, in which we hosted historians, scholars of religious studies, sociologists, and political scientists from various universities. In November, we switched gears and focused on the Holocaust, especially the meaning of the Holocaust as we learn through, as we reflect on it through historical research and through literature. So we hosted a program with Natalie Alexian of Tour College. She discussed her work with our colleague Anna Chihope-Gajaj. And then we had three discussions actually that focused on thinking through literature after Auschwitz. We had it with Professor Natalie Lozinski-Vich, with Professor Brian Goodman, and then finally a panel with Professor Claudia Sudowski-Smith, who interviewed both of those professors who are here with us at ASU. And we are ending our public offerings for this semester by two lectures with Dr. Janette Silverman, who is a professional genealogist, an editor, and an educator. So she holds a PhD in Jewish Studies from Spertus Institute in Chicago, and her dissertation traced the genealogy of her own family that migrated to the United States from Europe. So she covered the main area, the main decades of Jewish immigration, 1880s to 1920s. Her lecture last week, to those of you who joined us last week, you know that she focused on the actual experience of the migrants themselves, the challenges that they face, and to some extent, those challenges are also the challenges that the researcher in Jewish genealogy faces. So tonight, she's going to help us understand more clearly what are those challenges that the researcher in Jewish genealogy faces and how to overcome the challenges. So as we're listening to her presentation, please put your questions in the Q&A function rather than in the chat function, if you don't mind. And after the talk, I will begin by asking a question or two, and then we'll open it up to questions from all of you. So now let me turn off the camera and my microphone, and we are going to just listen to Dr. Silverman. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I am delighted to be here this evening with you and thrilled that so many of you have joined us tonight. As Jews, many of us grew up thinking that no records of our families in Europe survived the devastation of Jewish life during World War II. Worse, families often refused to discuss the lives they or their immigrant ancestors had in Europe. They refused to name the relatives who remained in Europe or to share the names or descriptions of the places that they were from. If they were spoken of, towns and villages named often couldn't be identified on a map. People were often referred to by so many different names, it seemed as though there were 5 separate individuals. Today, I'm going to discuss why identifying the names of our ancestors, the dates of births, deaths, and marriages, and the places they came from are so difficult. We should have plenty of time at the end to be able to speak and answer questions and explore this a little bit more. Growing up in a Jewish home in New York, I took our traditions, our Jewish traditions and culture as a norm. In the same way, when I began my genealogical research, I took the challenges I encountered as something I would find doing any research. In other words, I thought that Jewish research was the same as everything else. I know differently now. All research has challenges. Each ethnic and religious group's research poses difficulties in identifying either names, dates of events, or places ancestors lived. I think, though, that Jewish research takes all of those challenges and puts them together so that rather than needing to identify just one of these, our research is compounded because most of the time, names, dates, and places all need to be discovered. A lot of what I'm going to discuss today has to do with the application and meaning of Jewish culture when seen through the lens of genealogical research and understanding the quirks of Jewish research. Many things I plan to touch on are probably things you already know, but we're going to take a brief look at how culture and tradition inform the research. In other words, you can't separate who we are as a people through our culture and our traditions from the research that's necessary to be able to identify where we came from, when we came from there, how we lived, and even something as simple as what our names were. If you're familiar with genealogical research, you may have noted how the dates of our ancestors' births or their years of birth change from document to document. Spelling of their names change from document to document, and in most places, either a specific locale in which they were born is incomprehensible, or the document just says Poland, Russia, Lithuania, Germany, or Austria, just to name a few. We're going to start by looking at what I consider to be the least complicated of these issues, dates. What I'm discussing first is, I think, the easiest of these challenges to understand. We all know what a calendar is, right? How different could it be? How difficult could it be? Well, it always helps if you want to find records to know who you're looking for and the dates associated with them. Names are not unique. And no matter where in the world you're searching for a person's documents, there may be many people born or who died in the same years who had the same names. Sometimes we're really surprised by the results of our research. I don't mean finding out that your aunt who claimed for several decades to be 30 years old wasn't really 30 years old for that whole period. I mean something else. So let's take a look and see if we can figure out what the issue is with dates. The Jewish calendar, of course, is where we find Jewish holidays. On hebcal.com, I can get a calendar which has the Jewish calendar superimposed on a secular calendar. But there's more than just these dates to take into consideration when looking at events that concerned our ancestors. Many of us joke around about how our ancestors didn't know when they were born. Sometimes, even in the US, birth, marriage, or death records aren't available. Each state mandated that these records be kept at different points in time. Each state also has their own privacy laws, and records after a certain date can't be accessed unless you're a direct descendant of a person. And if that person had no children, then until the privacy statute time period has been passed, you can't access the record. The only person who can is someone who a court has appointed to investigate somebody's records, generally because of probate or other legal issues. Some records have been destroyed either deliberately or through accident. Once, I was trying to get a death record for a woman who died childless in 1955. She was an only child, and she was in her 80s when she died. The officials kept telling me that the only way I could receive her death record before the privacy statute passed was if I was her child or grandchild. Since she had neither, and it was close to 140 years since she was born, this struck me really as overkill, but there was no way to get around it. When we're looking at European records, this becomes even more compounded because although we can understand, say 100 years since a person was born, maybe 80 years since they married, and maybe 50 years since they died, what happens when it's not only talking about the one record you're looking for? In European record books, we're talking about lots of records being bound together in a book. And those privacy statutes date from the last record in a book. So if your ancestor was born 100 years ago, but the most recent record in that book was only 50 years ago, you still have another 50 years to go. And if somebody made a note in that book only 10 or 20 years ago, then that restarts the clock too. So you need to be aware when you're looking for information about privacy statutes as well as other things. Other things like when and where your ancestor was born. So let's take a look at a little problem. Well, maybe not a problem, how about just a challenge? This is information about my grandfather who died in 1980. On the left side is information from Barnett Moldavsky's naturalization application. And on the right side of the page is information from his Social Security record. Barnett arrived in the US at the age of 4 in 1910. The whole family celebrated his birthday on July 10th. Not a problem. You can see both the petition for naturalization and his Social Security application have the same birth date, July 10th, 1906. By the way, the funny looking place that he was born on the side of the screen, on the left side of the screen, by his petition, says Zhytomyr. That's exactly what it said on his naturalization. That's Zhytomyr, now in Ukraine, formerly in the Russian Empire. When I was first in Ukrainian archives in 2009, I decided I wanted to get his birth record. The archivist brought out the records for me. They're not certificates, but books of registers. Some of the registers have as many as 10 records on a 2-page spread. This one had 4, and I searched through all the records that were there for the month of July 1906, and I didn't find anything. How could that be? Born July 10th, 1906. It's really clear, and it's written on these pages. Well, this is a copy of his original birth record from the Zhytomyr archives in Ukraine. Zhytomyr is the county seat of the Volhynia province, and it's not far from Kiev. You can see on here in that green box, that green rectangle, that's my grandfather's birth record. Dov, then Avraham Moldavsky. Of course, I didn't find anything in July because he was born in June, not July. How could that be? You saw what he wrote. Surely he knew his birth date, and his parents were alive. His parents came to the US with him. His mother didn't die until the late 1940s. She was certainly there when he applied in the 1920s for his naturalization. Why didn't she correct him? This information that he wasn't born in July, that he was born in June, had me shaking my head. I was really surprised. It was definitely not what I had been expecting. His birth record said June 19. His US documents said July 10th. In this case, dates are an issue if we have little else to go on to determine whether we're looking at the correct person. Since his birth record listed his parents, it's clear that the birth record was for the correct person. My mother knew her grandparents' names. She knew her grandparents. No one's names were at an issue. That was definitely him. But there were several calendar issues. We needed to shift between the Julian calendar, which was the calendar used in the Russian Empire until World War I and is still used for Orthodox holidays, which is why the Eastern Orthodox Christmas and New Year's are not celebrated on December 25th and January 1st. June 19th, 1906, on the Julian calendar was the equivalent of July 2nd, 1906 on the Gregorian calendar. The Gregorian calendar is a calendar we use as our secular calendar. However, all of us can see that July 2nd is not July 10th. HeapCal, which I mentioned earlier, is fantastic for conversions from the Gregorian calendar to the Jewish calendar and vice versa. But it isn't the calendar per se that resolves this particular issue. The thing we needed to consider is a Brit Milah, a bris. Although there are, counting July 2nd, 9, not 8 days until July 10th, if he was born after sunset, then although the date on a secular calendar might still be July 2nd, it would on a Jewish calendar be the day after, since days begin at sunset. I said you needed to know something about Jewish culture and traditions. Now, this was the easiest of all the challenges to explain. In brief, there are 3 calendars to consider. When we look at dates from immigrants on US documents, we need to consider that those dates might, depending on where the immigrant was from, be on a different calendar. Many places in Europe adopted the Gregorian calendar decades, sometimes a century, earlier than the Russian Empire did. We need to know where our ancestors were from in order to understand when things happen. We need to use a calendar conversion tool, such as the one on stevemorse.org, to make a conversion from Gregorian to Julian, so we have 2 possible dates in mind. We may need a robust Jewish calendar, such as the one on HeapCal, to see when holidays were. And if there's a gap between the date of death and burial, for example, it might be because of a Jewish holiday. Or we need to determine when a holiday might have disrupted an event. Why is there a huge gap between Pesach, Passover, and Shavuot when no marriages occur? If we didn't know when the holidays were, all we would know is that during May, we might not see many weddings. And then all of a sudden, in a register, we're going to see a cluster of them on a certain date. Lag BaOmer, perhaps, or Rosh Chodesh. Sometimes, too, a gravestone will put a death in relationship to a holiday, and we need to see what the secular date of death was in order to find a death record. You can, of course, change dates from Hebrew to Gregorian to Julian, as well as from Julian to Gregorian. But all of these things need to be taken into consideration when we're looking at records that come from Europe. Now we're going to get into something that's pretty hard. The border changes in Europe affected all the inhabitants of Europe, but may be most noticeable when dealing with Jewish research, partly because, unlike other Europeans, Jews may not have had a deep connection with the countries in which they resided. The language they spoke at home was probably Yiddish, although they may have used other languages in the workplace or market, such as German, Polish, and Russian. This next section may be the most complicated of the three challenges. We're going to take a look at some maps and the confusion that those maps depict. You can see on this map that two major cities that are today in Poland, Warsaw and Krakow, are not even in the same country pre-World War I. Some of what is today in Romania was in the Austrian Empire. Kiev, Minsk, and Vilnius are all in the Russian Empire on this map. Today, of course, they're the capitals of Ukraine, Belarus, and Lithuania. The subject of today's discussion regarding geopolitical movement is very complex, and I readily admit that I'm oversimplifying some, if not everything, I'm going to say. The changing maps or laws that permitted people to live in one place and not another can take days or weeks of study for complete understanding. We are really only just touching the tip of the iceberg. Poland was massive. Everything on this map in pink was at one time part of Poland. Until 1772, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was huge and encompassed most of what we know of as Belarus, Lithuania, Poland, Ukraine, and more. Between 1772 and 1795, this Commonwealth was partitioned 3 times, and the land was ceded to the Kingdom of Prussia and the Austrian and Russian empires. Poland and Lithuania didn't exist again until after World War I. When I was a child in Hebrew school, we heard about something mysterious called partitions. I had no idea what this meant at the time. Now I work with the resulting confusion of those partitions all the time. When I say the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was partitioned 3 times during that period, I'm not speaking of something simple and clean. Even after the area was divided, the borders changed several times. The Kingdom of Prussia gained and lost territory, as did the Austrian and Russian empires. Napoleon came in and wrought havoc over some of these same areas, which were reabsorbed into the empires after he left. Names of places changed as the languages changed. Laws changed, sometimes daily. Other times they would last for a year or 2 years and then change with the shift in a monarch. And I'm not talking about simple laws. And I'm not talking about things that necessarily had to go through a larger legislative body in order to be enacted. These kings and emperors had total control. They only consulted other people when they thought there was going to be a problem. And Jews were the problem, not the laws to contain them. Jews had been excluded from the Russian Empire since the end of the 15th century. After the partitions, of course, this was no longer the case. The Russian Empire was confronted with having to deal with a Jewish population who resided in the area that was ceded to Russia in the Polish partitions between 1772 and 1795. This area, which the Russians called the Pale of Settlement, would eventually be home to millions of Jews. By 1885, over 4 million Jews wanted to inhabit the Pale. Although we often think of our ancestors in Eastern Europe living in one place for generations, it was not always the case. For example, in 1882, over 500,000 Jews were forced from their homes in rural areas to live in towns that were shtetls in the Russian Empire. 250,000 Jews living on the western frontier of the Russian Empire were moved into the Pale, and almost 750,000 Jews living east of the Pale were forced to relocate into it by 1891. In addition to those forced locations, sometimes Jewish families were given permission to resettle outside the Pale because of military service, wealth, or because they were craftsmen of crafts that were desirous to have housed in cities or other villages. From 1839 to 1841, as another example, the Russian Empire recruited settlers from what is now Latvia to Kherson and other areas where agricultural communities were being established. So not only do we need to know, excuse me, where our relatives lived when they emigrated from Europe to the United States or elsewhere, we also need to know where else they might have lived within the Russian Empire or any of the other empires. I was researching a family not long ago. They were in Lithuania. There was no question they were in what's today Lithuania. They were in the Kaunas province in Lithuania. We found them in a town, and we're merrily going along doing our research and finding more and more records for them. And all of a sudden, we find a record that references another town. We go looking in that other town, and we find more records about the family. And following breadcrumbs like this, we finally identified them in 5 different towns. It's probably kind of like a circle. And to complete the circle, to go around in a circle was about 100 miles. To go from one point to another was maybe 20. So the research is never quite as simple as it seems that it might be. In addition to the Pale of settlement, a large number of Jews lived in Galicia in the Austrian Empire. This was formed from the first and third partitions of Poland in 1772 and 1795. I really should say the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Today, this area is primarily divided between Poland and Ukraine. And you can see all the little towns that were in Galicia on this map. And the formal name is the Kingdom of Galicia and Lodomeria. And that last name is taken from a variation of Vladimir. You can see it when you sound it out, not when you're looking at how it's spelled. And this was just before World War I, at the beginning of World War I, 1914. So how do we figure out where our ancestors were from? My grandmother, who I knew, said she was Polish. She spoke Polish. And she came from Stanislav, or Stanislav, or Stanislavov. I was always confused by what she was talking about. When I tried to find it in an atlas, I couldn't find a town with that name anywhere that was in Poland. And the closest I came was a place in Hungary. So how do I figure out what she was talking about? Well, for this, I'm going to use Jewish Gen. Jewish Gen will require you to register, but it's a free registration. And it's a marvelous, marvelous collection of records and data about Jews, Judaism, places where we live. And I'm going to refer to a couple of different searches on Jewish Gen from here on through the rest of my talk. So you can log in to Jewish Gen. Once you get a login, as I said, it's free, but you do need to set up your credentials. And you can do a variety of different searches. I like to do more narrow searches than broad searches. So I might pull down the databases, and I'll show you about that in just a minute. You can search for a town. You can search for a surname. You can search Ancestry. Ancestry has a partnership with Jewish Gen, and we have for many years. And It has links to a lot of documents. Other documents that it doesn't link to may describe where you can find them. For most searches, you do need to be a member of Jewish Gen. For the purposes of identifying a town, membership isn't necessary. From the main menu, from the main page, you're going to click the button Databases and then choose Town Finder. This is going to take you to something called the Jewish Gen Communities Database, which is kind of like an atlas, kind of like a small gazetteer. A gazetteer is like a dictionary of towns, and gazetteers generally have quite a bit of information about a town, more than you might find in an atlas. In this search bar, I'm putting in my grandmother's town and I'm clicking Start the Search. I can choose the default, phonetically like, or if that doesn't turn up anything useful, then I want to choose Sounds Like, which I've done. You can see that right above where it says Start the Search. There's a white rectangle right above it, and it says Sounds Like. I can also follow a link to the Jewish Gen Gazetteer if nothing there appears. You can see the link to the Jewish Gen Gazetteer off on the left of the screen. I can look at the Gazetteer also to follow up if I do find something. And we're going to take a look at that momentarily. So when I clicked on Stanislav, 3 matches came up. The last one in Belarus doesn't look good at all. I'm not really sure why it came up, except if I try pronouncing some of those names of the towns in other languages, I might come up with something that sounds a little like it. But I'm going to knock that out of the running. She said it was in Poland, so I don't think it was the place that's in Romania either. So not in Romania, not in Belarus. It's most likely the place that was in Poland during the interwar period, and that makes sense since my grandmother left Europe in 1920 when the area was Poland. The list gives me some alternate names. The name of the place pre-World War I, Stanislav in Stanislavov, Galicia in the Austrian Empire, what it was called during the interwar period, what it was called after 1950, after World War II, and what it's called today. So today it's called Ivano-Frankivsk. It's named after a very famous Ukrainian poet. If I click on the star that's off to the left of the town name, I'm going to see more information, including what the place name looks like in Russian and Ukrainian Cyrillic. And yes, although they both use the Cyrillic alphabet, they're 2 different alphabets and languages, the same way French, Spanish, and English all use Latin letters, but they're all different languages. It also tells me what the population, the Jewish population was in 1900 and 1931. Look at how it grew. Is there anything else I can find out about it? Well, I'm going to try the Gazetteer with this name and see what happens. So I've gone into the Gazetteer, and the pull-down menu has the same thing as the Town Finder, but I'm going to try doing something else. I'm going to look at that last column on the right, the one that says 10-mile radius. Maybe your ancestor mentioned other towns in addition to the main town that they said they came from. Well, let's take a look. So this is only a fraction of the number of towns that are within a 10-mile radius. There are 75 towns. Those that have a Jewish population are going to have a star similar to the one next to Ivano-Frankivsk. I can also go right to a map. Now that I know where she was from, and I know what my best tool is going to be to find it, I can go look it up on Wikipedia. I can look it up on Google Maps. I can look it up in a lot of different places. History book. Since our ancestors often lived in places that were smaller than the town they lived, this list of nearby places may also help to identify where they really lived. Why would you say someplace smaller? Well, I grew up in Far Rockaway, New York. It's in Queens County. It's near JFK Airport, and it's part of New York City. When people ask me where I'm from, I generally don't say I'm from Far Rockaway. I say I'm from New York. And then they can ask questions. But lots of people never heard of Far Rockaway. Let's take a look at a couple of other more difficult examples. Someone claims to be from Brady. I do a similar search on Jewish Gen, and again, come up with 3 places. In this case, that ancestor did not claim a country of origin. So what can I do to figure it out? I can look at other records, ship manifest, naturalization, census, marriage and death records, birth records for the person's children or siblings, to see if anything more specific geographically is mentioned. The last towns on this page are 2 places that in 1950 were both called by the same name. To make things even more complicated, if you look off to the right, you'll see that they were both in the Lublin province before World War I and also during the interwar period. One is 91 miles southeast of Warsaw, and the other is 151 miles southeast of Warsaw. The only thing I can do is look to see if other towns in the Lublin province were noted on records for the families. This morning, I was researching a family who lived in several different towns in Lublin, but they didn't live in any in Puławy, but they did live in a couple in Białgoraj district, and that, in fact, was the town where they were from, the one that's 151 miles southeast of Warsaw. So I found it by going in a roundabout way, looking for other collateral information that might help me to identify which town they lived in. Why do I need to know which town? Well, records in Eastern Europe for Jewish families are divided by town, then time period and type of record. Sometimes you're going to find birth, marriage, and death records all together in one book, but they're always divided by town. Sometimes several towns may be in one record book. Sometimes the towns are going to be only in records by themselves. If you don't know where your ancestors were, where the people you're researching were, you may have a really tough time finding them. There is no main centralized database. In the US, if you're looking for somebody, perhaps you'll find them in a record like a US Census or Social Security database. Those are countrywide, and you may be able to narrow down where your relatives were from, but you've got to have an inkling of where they were from in order to find them on a census. If you find a Social Security index card that says that somebody got their Social Security number in Florida, but you know this person only ever lived in California from birth to death, that's not the right person. So knowing where, not only when, but where and who is going to help you. Now, those last searches were relatively easy. What happens when I have a lot of choices? And several of them are from the same empire. I might start by identifying some characteristics from places on the list. That will help me narrow it down. I'm going to start with Kashan, Iran. Chances are that if your ancestor was a Persian Jew, you might already know that. If they never said anything about speaking Farsi or being Persian or identifying with that community, you can take that off your list. What languages did your ancestors speak besides Yiddish? Did they ever describe something near their home? How about their surname? A search on Jewish Gen in a unified search might potentially show you a distribution of their surname, which potentially will help narrow it down. By the way, if your ancestor had siblings who also immigrated, you might consider researching those collateral relatives to see if their documentation leads you to the right place, or at least narrows things down. Keep in mind that if your ancestors said they were from Russia, although it might point to today's Russia, chances are it doesn't, and that it's the Russian Empire. Similarly, if they said Austria, that possibly references the Austrian Empire, not Austria. If they said something like Russia, Poland, that'll help narrow it down. Look through the list of the way places were called and where they were prior to World War I. And then look at the second column from the left at the way the town was called in various languages to help you narrow down the field. Maybe those variations of the name, the way the name was pronounced, will help you. I find that a lot of the times our ancestors spoke of a place with the Yiddish name, not the name by which it was officially known. And you're not going to find the Yiddish name anyplace but here. There is only a very slim chance that you'll find that Yiddish name in any of the atlases or gazetteers. Oh, I should point out to you something else. If you're using a gazetteer, the country is only going to appear in the gazetteer with the name as it was known at the time the gazetteer was published. So if you're looking at a gazetteer from 1839, but you only know the name from post-World War I, you may not find the name of that place in that gazetteer. You're going to have to do some more research to see what it might have been called back in the 19th century. Let's go to the final thing that we're going to be discussing. Names. You do remember what Shakespeare said about a rose by any other name, right? Our immigrant ancestors' names are really tricky characters. In Europe, they may have been written in any one of a number of languages, and until we see them written in one of those languages, it's not possible to actually know what it originally was. All we can do is go by the way it sounds. When you're looking for your ancestors, forget about the spelling. Forget about the way the name looks. Go for the sound. And you have to take into consideration that other people were going for the sound too. When they said their name to a census taker, to an enumerator, that person was writing down what they heard. Perhaps what they heard, your Eastern European ancestors say with their Yiddish accent being then translated into English or Latin letters by someone whose ancestors may have been from Italy or Scandinavia. They're going to be spelling it in a way that might not seem familiar to you until you try sounding it out. And sound's another thing. Most of the time when we're looking at indexes for those records that are indexed, there's no standardization for the transcriptions from one language to another. So go for the sound. But sometimes the sound's not enough. Take my great-great-grandparents. These are the death certificates of my second great-grandparents. That is, my great-great-grandparents. There are some real problems with these death records. First of all, Rose's last name on her death record is not what her last name is on her husband's death record. Come to think of it, neither of their names match. On Rose's 1932 death certificate, she's Rose Mellon, married to Harvey Mellon, or maybe Harry Mellon. On her husband's death record, he's Herschel Millen, and she's Rachel Millen. Confusing? Gets worse. To make things worse, their surnames were neither Millen nor Mellon, yet these are their graves. It's pretty safe to bet that these are names close to them would have been the names they used on their immigration documents. And by the way, they wouldn't have immigrated. He would not have immigrated with the name Harris. She might have immigrated with the name Rose or Rachel. But Harris, not going to happen. Take a look at their Hebrew names or their Yiddish names on the gravestone. He's Tzvi. So he's going to have immigrated with the name Tzvi. Or is he? Maybe he's not going to have immigrated with a Hebrew name. Maybe he will have been known more familiarly by Hirsch, the Yiddish counterpart for Tzvi. Her name is Chaya Rachel on her gravestone, but how's it going to be spelled if you have to look at it in Latin letters? Is it going to be Chaia? Is it going to be Haya? Is there going to be a J instead of that I sound? What's it going to look like? Use your imagination, and you'll probably still be off and struggling with those ship benefits. So is this one guy or two? It seems like it must be one guy. How many people, after all, are named Edwin Harrison? But I want to check to make sure Mr. Ginsburg and Mr. Gaines are the same person. So what can I do? Well, take a closer look at both of these cards. One is a draft registration card for World War I, and one that's on the left. And on the right is the World War II Selective Service Registration card. You'll see that the birth date, May 31st, 1895, is the same on both. Well, okay, lots of people were born on May 31st, 1895. But how many people were born in St. Catharines, Canada, named Edwin Harrison on that very date in that year? Well, you probably will have to take a look at some Canadian censuses in 1901 and 1911 in order to see if there were more Edwin Harrisons living in St. Catharines, Canada, but I kind of doubt it. So you've just taken a leap of faith and you've made an assumption that this is the same guy. Go look further, find out about his parents, see who his parents were. Although he was an immigrant from Canada, maybe his parents immigrated from Europe. Maybe the family's records going back generations are going to be in Canada. But chances are you're not going to find Edwin Harrison Gaines in the Canadian records if his earlier record, the World War I draft registration, says that he was born there. That's an earlier record than the record in the 1940s from World War II. Go with the earliest record. Chances are that's the name that you're going to find in Canadian databases. Now let's take a look at something else. What is this person's name? Malka, Molly, Esther, Ernestina. How are the names morphing? One of my favorite databases on Jewish Gen is the Given Names database. I can look up a name and the database will provide some local names and also some context. For example, and I can look up the names, by the way, in different countries. If I look up Malka in Poland to see what my Polish ancestor Malka might have been called, I find that she might have been called Esther or Stira from Estira, and perhaps even Ernestina. And this database also gives me a biblical origin for a name. I can look up the name Esther in the book by the same name, chapter 2, verse 15. I can see what all the Yiddish nicknames might be. And I can see that she might have been called Esther Malka, which is why it came up when I looked up Malka. After all, Queen Esther. I can see that there's a bunch of Yiddish nicknames. and that the local secular name, that would be local in Poland, if she needed to have a secular name, because many of the countries required that people have a secular name in addition to their Yiddish or Hebrew name. So records are going to be in both names, just to make life more complicated, that her name might have been Esther, Estira, Estering, or Ernestina. It says in the US her name might be Anna or Esther, but in the US, as well as many other countries, the Hebrew name or Yiddish name is not informing the English name or the French name or the Spanish name. In Austria, if I look it up, there's going to be other options. In Austria, I can see that her name's going to be Malka, and the second name isn't male, it's Mali, or Malya, or Malch. And in Yiddish, she'll be called Malki. But what if she's not from either of those countries? How about in Lithuania? There's still going to be other names. In Lithuania, she might be called Mala in Yiddish, or Malkala, or Maltza, or Malya. And in the US, she might be Amalia, or Martha, or Matilda, or Mildred, or Molly, or Regina, or Tilly, right? Go figure. You just can't count on anything being the equivalent of something else, unless, of course, it's a name that translates exactly from the Hebrew into English or whatever the local language is. What do I mean? Sarah, Rivka equals Rebecca, Abraham equals Abraham, Shlomo equals Samuel or Solomon, believe it or not. Although Shmuel should be Samuel and Shlomo should be Solomon, you're going to find many Shlomos called Samuel or Sam. To figure out variations of names, you're going to need to consider where your ancestors came from. You can probably figure that your Jewish Eastern European ancestors didn't leave continental Europe with names like Jane, Robert, Chloe, Bruce, or Harris. You need to not only know their Hebrew or Yiddish names, but take into consideration some of the nicknames by which they might have been called. If you don't know a Hebrew or Yiddish name, and there isn't one on a gravestone, you might think about the name that they were called in the language of the country in which they settled and look at some of these alternatives. Remember, and I can't stress this enough, that even for a name that's the equivalent of a Hebrew name, even for a name that has an English equivalent or an equivalent in a local language, that may not have been what your ancestor chose to be called. So an example, my sister, whose Hebrew name is Shoshana. Well, her Yiddish name was Lima Reitza, actually, and her English name is Randy. My Hebrew name is Yafa, my English name is Janet, and my Yiddish name is Shana Minza. So you can't always figure what the Hebrew or Yiddish equivalent is going to be, but if you're looking in those European records, that's what you need to know because that's the name you're looking for. Now, I want to point out something that you'll be able to find on Ancestry. So Ancestry's got a lot of partners in the Jewish community, including Jewish Gen, as I mentioned, the American Joint Distribution Committee, that's the JDC, the American Jewish Historical Society, Miriam Weiner Roots to Roots Foundation, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, the University of Southern California Shoah Foundation, and the Arrowson Archives. And the collection that they have is well over 20 million Jewish historical records. Now, Some of those records are searchable for free. How do you find out what you can search for free? You can go to Ancestry and you can use their search and take a look at catalog and type in Jewish or Holocaust or any other word that's typically associated with Jews and Jewish records and see what pops up. And you'll see something at the bottom. You see here, it says these Jewish family history collections will remain free as long as they exist on Ancestry.com. And then it's got some featured collections. And then it says on the right that there's premium collections that are available with an Ancestry membership. And some of those Jewish records will require a paid Ancestry membership or a free 14-day trial. I encourage you to look at all the possibilities for records, all of the possibilities. And don't just look in one place. Something that's indexed one way in one place might be indexed a different way because of either details in the transcriptions or because of the algorithms that are being used to sort through things. So you need to, don't just be satisfied with one place. You don't find what you're looking for, look someplace else. For example, if you're not finding a World War I or World War II draft registration, or you're looking for military pension files, you might go to fold 3. On Ancestry, you might find links to Find a Grave, and you want to click through on those links that are there to the Find a Grave website and take a look there. Same with newspapers.com. You'll find indexes on Ancestry. And if you've got a newspapers.com membership, you want to click through there and see the full newspaper article. Don't be satisfied with a transcription. When you're looking at a transcription, you're looking at what somebody else thought the record said, but that's not necessarily what the record actually said. My great-grandmother Pearl is transcribed on a record as Peppy. Not her name, she was never called Peppy. Somebody looked at a copy of a particular record, and that was what they thought was written on it. When transcribers are working on records, they don't always see what you're seeing when you're looking at these records online, or even what you might be seeing if you're looking at a record through a microfilm machine. Sometimes I've done plenty of transcriptions. I did transcriptions years ago when you couldn't look at a record online. And sometimes I would just get a Xerox copy of those records. Some of those Xerox copies were really blurry. Some of them were really dark. I would hold pieces of paper up to a window to see if the light coming through would give me any more information in an attempt to read what was on those records. So if there's errors in transcription, it's not always the transcriber's fault, although there's probably plenty of times when I made a typo, did a typographical error, and all of a sudden that became part of that index. The indexes are created from transcription. Open the record if you've got access to it. Look at the record. See if there's something that wasn't included in a transcription, like a note off to the side, or see if there's something that's more clearly written than what you're seeing. Sometimes an enumerator, and you see this especially in state censuses, not so much in US federal censuses, where they will be taking notes about a family, and then another family winds up in the middle of one family. And so the family is separated, and it's only by looking at the page in the census that you see this. If you're looking at a census and a family member is not in the enumeration of the family, look at the end of what that enumerator did and see if they picked up additional families or additional members of a family on that last page. Be surprised what you can find by looking a little further than just the index that you see on the screen. Thank you very much for joining me today. I've had a great time being here, and I look forward to continuing our conversation and to seeing you at other programs that I'll be presenting at. My next presentations are going to be at the Salt Lake Institute of Genealogy, where I join Emily Garber, Laura Diamond, and Marion Smith while we present a week-long exploration of Galicia and Pale of Settlement Jews. Thank you again.
Thank you, Janet. For some reason, the system doesn't allow me to bring back my picture. So maybe, Lisa, you can do something about it. It has to do with whoever is the host of the meeting. And somehow my picture is blocked. But I'm going to pose the question anyway, and then we'll start the conversation. So, the first thing which is kind of obvious, is what you're doing is a detective work. It's really first-rate detective work. So what makes a good Jewish detective, a good Jewish genealogist? How can what would you consider most important to the success of your work?
I'm kind of laughing when you ask that. The concept of peel, pulling something apart to the size of a pepper seed, like when you're studying Talmud or Torah and you're pulling everything apart. That's what you need. That's the skill that you need to have when you're doing this. You need to have endless curiosity. Every time you find something, you need to ask another question. You need to follow the breadcrumbs. It's one of those Hansel and Gretel kind of stories.
Yeah, that's a very good, it's an excellent response. So my next question would be, what's the impact of Jewish genealogical research on our understanding of our Jewish identity? Is it fair to say that the focus now becomes really ethnicity or biology, somewhat at the expense of culture, religion, ideas, values, norms? You see the direction I'm going. So what happens when we focus on genealogical research as far as our understanding of Jewishness is concerned?
So as Jews, we have an odd concept of family. I was speaking to somebody a couple of weeks ago, and she said to me, wow, it's really amazing that so many people who aren't related to the relative that I was visiting come and visit. And I said, yeah, she's got a lot of friends that are local. And then she named a couple of people. And I said, I don't understand what you mean. Those are cousins. How could they be cousins? So I had to explain. Our sense of family is a very tribal, communal sense of family. And it is the understanding of that says that we're not just relegating this stuff to what your DNA says or anything that simple. When my dad, we had a dentist when I was a kid, and my dad always said that he was his cousin. We started doing this research, and my father said, I don't know how he was my cousin, but my mother always said he was my cousin. Well, when we went into a relationship chart, we discovered that this guy was my father's third cousin, twice removed. And then we had to disentangle all those relationships to see who the actual relationship was with. But we're not just what you would call a nuclear family. It's not just a mom and dad and their kids, or even kids and their parents and grandparents and siblings. It's so much more expansive than that. And if you're Jewish and if you're an Eastern European Jew and you've done a DNA test with Ancestry, you've got tens of thousands, perhaps fourth cousin and closer relatives. If you can look at the number of total matches, you'll probably find hundreds of thousands of matches because we are all related. And we're not all just related through our DNA. We're related through cultural relationships. We're related through the traditions. We are so interwoven with each other. There's no way to just separate it into something simple. So I don't know, Chava, if that answered your question.
Yeah.
But it's the only concept that I have of family.
Yeah, no, that's very good. So let's try to do two things because I see questions both on the Q&A as well as on the chat. So if you can look at the Q&A and begin to respond to the question and then maybe go to the chat and cover whatever is there that needs to be responded to.
Sure. So Adam asked about, for interwar Poland, how can one locate Jewish birth records, governmental birth records, Jewish burial records, marriages, and the rest? Adam, you can't. So there's a 100-year privacy law in Poland for birth records. The only births that you can look at are births before 2021. And if the births are in a book where there's more recent births, you can't. If you are the direct descendant of someone who it falls under those privacy records, you would need to prove that you are. You can write to the Polish archive. It's going to be at the civil registration office, anything that's privacy protected. If it's not privacy protected, then it's going to be at the archives, at the historical archives. But anything that's privacy protected will be at the civil registry office. And to get a record, you're going to have to prove your relationship. A lot of the time they won't release a record. You'll need somebody on site to go in with a power of attorney for you to get it. I have been in civil registration offices with a person who is a direct descendant, like a grandchild of that person who we were looking for, and they would not permit us to look at the record. They would read the record to us. They would cover everything else up on the page so we could see just a little bit of that record, but we couldn't get a copy and we couldn't get the record. They would read the record to us and we could hurry up and type a transcription, but that was it. So I hope that answers your question. Linda asked a question about names. Hanalea in Yiddish, Anna in English. What would this correspond to for a family from Austria and Moldova in Jewish Gen? You're going to have to look it up, Linda. I can't tell you. There are thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of names and their variations. And a name could be almost anything. Just because somebody's Anna in English does not mean that they're Hannah in Europe. If you take a look at their gravestone, if they are Hannah, maybe it's going to be Hansel. Maybe it's going to be Hanala. Maybe it's going to be Hannah. Maybe it's going to be Anna. I looked at a gravestone for somebody and her name was clearly written, not with a chet, but with a hey. And it was in Yiddish. There was an ayin in there and it was Hannah. And that was how she went by. That was the name in European records. You're going to have to look it up though yourself. I'm sorry, I can't answer the question. Michael said that an immigration person would translate this out. No. I didn't say that about an immigration person. For immigration records, those records are all, the immigration manifest has already been written in the language of the country that the person's going to. So anybody who's immigrating to the US, an arrival manifest is going to be in English letters. And the name is going to be clearly written there. They're going to have an identification card and a name tag that's going to have their name written the same way it appears on that manifest. And I was not speaking about immigration officials just now. I was speaking about immigrants and about how they were going to say their names for records once they'd gotten to the US. You can look at, I've looked at plenty of marriage records where somebody actually signed the marriage record in Hebrew letters. They clearly did not know how to write in English. And so whoever was filling out the marriage form, the application for the license, was filling it out from however they were understanding the person saying their name. I'm not sure, Eileen, what your question means. I don't work for the Mormon Church. Ancestry is not part of the Mormon Church. As far as I know, what they've done is microfilmed or digitized actual records and created indexes from them. Nobody's changing records. Linda, how can we trace melodies? You can take a look at the Smithsonian catalog. They may have some of the, they may have some Yiddish music catalogs. You can do an investigation online of musicology. I don't know how you can trace a song or melodies. Is the fuzziness of the search results because the governments have changed over times? I'm not quite sure what that means, John. Must be easier for Jews from Germany? No, there's nothing easy about the research, whether Jews were from Germany where they had a similar kind of language to ours or from elsewhere. Jews had many different names by which they were known. German was the official language in the Austrian Empire, so there's plenty of German names included in there, but the names could be just about anything. I wouldn't make any kind of hard and fast rule about it. And Judith asked, does it make sense that someone named Yitzchak Chaya was known as Shmuel in his family? I don't know. I can't tell you. People were known by lots of different names. Annette asked if Ancestry has all of Jewish Gen's records. I don't know what the percentage of the transcriptions are that Ancestry has of Jewish Gens. Ancestry doesn't have the actual records. What you might find is that you're coming up with an index. I usually take that index then because I know how the name is going to appear in Jewish Gen and the town that it's going to be associated with. And then I go back to Jewish Gen and do a search with that information to find either a larger transcription or a link to a record. JRI Poland is fantastic with links to records. Litvak Sig's got some magnificent transcriptions, and you can contact them for copies of records. And okay, that's, sorry, Marilyn, how do you trace names when all you have to go by is so-and-so son of so-and-so? Look for records. Look for the records first of where they were, of where they immigrated, go backwards in time, start with what you know. If what you're talking about is how do you find somebody when all you know is a patronymic, such as, I don't know, Avraham ben Yosef or something like that. You start with something closer to the current day where people had surnames. In the Russian Empire. Surnames for the Jewish community were mandated starting in 1824. In 1835, they were mandated to only have unchangeable names. In other words, they would stop using patronymics, such as Ben Avraham or Isaacson or something like that. Abramovich, that's a patronymic. And you look for family groups. So you start with the group with a record that has the name, first and last name. You look for who's in that group and you go back generation by generation. There's census records, revision lists, conscription lists, and family lists that you might be able to find for your family. And once you've established what the family group looked like, you can go back in time to finding the family with patronymics, without last names. I know that in my family, I've found that back to a 1795 All Russia Census revision list, the foundation document of after the third partition, and was able then to go back to more local records from what I found. And the only way I found that was going back slowly, document by document, in order to be able to identify that. I think I've answered everybody's questions.
Yes, so this is really very exciting, kind of using the word exciting. Let me ask you, what do you find most exciting and what do you find most frustrating?
Oh, most frustrating. Well, let me tell you about a document I was looking at today where somebody had, it's from the Shoah, and on this particular document, the person who was a survivor had two sets of parents' names on that document. One of those sets of names, one of those couples, would have been way too old, in their 60s when she was born, and they were definitely not her grandparents. The other couple, I found them, found her birth record, her marriage record, have no idea what the connection is. I suspect that the guy who was in his 60s, the older man, was possibly her grandfather's brother, but I'm like hitting my head against a wall about finding that. On the other hand, from that same record, what was really exciting was finding that woman's birth record, her marriage record, and all of her siblings' birth records and her parents' marriage record, all in Polish records online. Those are the exciting things.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And I'm sure that it's very fascinating for the people on the program. I'm sorry that my picture cannot be shown for some technical reason that we will have to figure out when it's over. But let me thank all of you for attending our public programs this semester and actually throughout the year. And I hope you found them informative and intellectually enriching. And I wish you all a safe and happy holiday season and look forward to seeing many of you, or all of you, in our programs in 2022. So have a wonderful evening, and thanks again to Janette Silverman, and thank you to all of you. Good